Hello, I'm Peter Sands, Executive Director of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. This year, the Global Fund has to replenish its financial resources, raising the money to fund the next 3 years of our work to fight AIDS, TB and malaria. This replenishment process will culminate in October at a conference in Lyon hosted by President Macron of France. We're engaging in this process with a mix of hope and urgency. Hope because we have the opportunity to rid the world of 3 diseases that have killed millions of people and ravaged communities on every continent. Hope because we have the chance to take a massive step forward towards achieving the 3rd Sustainable Development Goal, known as SDG 3, health and well-being for all by 2030. But also urgency. Urgency because 2030 is only 11 years away. We're at a decisive moment. Do we step up the fight, or do we allow ourselves to slip back? Against such formidable adversaries as AIDS, TB and malaria, there is no middle ground. We're either winning or losing. So now is the time to deliver on our promise. Now is the time to step up the fight. We're coming to the Global Fund's 6th replenishment with an extraordinary record of success and much to be proud of. Death rates from the 3 diseases have fallen by more than 50% since 2002, when the Global Fund was first created. But we are also facing a hard truth. The remarkable progress we've made has stalled. Without more funding and new ways of working, we will see a resurgence in new infections and cases and an increase in deaths. Business as usual, by which we mean maintaining coverage of interventions at current levels, so by no means the worst case, is not going to get us to the global plans for the 3 diseases set out by our technical partners, WHO, UNAIDS, Stop TB and the RBM partnership, let alone to the SDG 3 goal of ending the epidemics by 2030. We have to do things differently. We have to step up the fight. We need more innovation, more collaboration, more effective execution. But we also need more money. For this replenishment, the Global Fund needs a minimum of $14 billion to meet our strategy targets. I emphasize a minimum of $14 billion because while this sum will enable us to achieve the strategy targets and get us back on track toward ending the epidemics, it will not fully close the gap with the global plans. In fact, to understand why we've set the target of at least $14 billion, it's important to understand the full picture of funding needs and sources. Working together with our technical partners, we estimate that getting back on track to the global plans would mean spending $101 billion over the next 3 years, 21 to 23. We project that $46 billion of this total can come from domestic resources in the affected countries. This would represent an increase of 48%, equivalent to roughly 14% per year. This is quite a stretch, but it's not unrealistic. To put it in context, domestic spending commitments in the current 3-year cycle are 41% higher than in the previous cycle. So in a sense, our investment case for the replenishment has 2 asks. One to the donors for at least $14 billion for the Global Fund, the other to implementer governments for $46 billion. Both need to happen if we're to get back on track. We don't assume any increase in other external sources of funding, so they stay constant at $23 billion. The $14 billion for the Global Fund will not get us to the full $101 billion total. That's why we say at least $14 billion. You can see what this means by looking at the resulting projections for mortality and incidence. A successful replenishment plus increased domestic resource mobilization should enable us to exceed the strategy target for 2023 in terms of reducing deaths and actually close most of the gap to the global plan figure. However, on incidence, $14 billion is the absolute minimum to hit the strategy target, and there's still quite a gap to the global plan numbers. This reflects an underlying strategic challenge we face. So far, we've done better on reducing the death toll from the 3 diseases than on reducing infections and cases. We've saved 27 million lives, a huge achievement. But ultimately, to end the epidemics and thus save countless future lives, we must accelerate the reduction in new infections. The imperative to step up the fight in terms of prevention holds true for all three diseases. In 2017, there were nearly 1.5 million new HIV infections in countries where the Global Fund invests. Infections will remain unacceptably high with an ever-increasing gap against the global plans without more investment in prevention. Two critical priorities are key populations and adolescent girls and young women. In too many countries, criminalization, discrimination and stigma are helping fuel concentrated epidemics among marginalized key populations, including men who have sex with men, sex workers, people who inject drugs, transgender people, prisoners and migrants. Unless the human rights-related barriers that prevent these key populations from accessing health services are tackled, we will not achieve the necessary reductions in infection rates. In a similar vein, we will only succeed in reducing the shocking rates of infection among adolescent girls and young women in some parts of Africa if we tackle the underlying root causes. Deep structural gender inequalities, including sexual violence, educational disadvantages, and economic disempowerment. We're seeing nearly 1,000 girls and young women being infected with HIV every day. In Africa, 3 out of 4 new infections among adolescents are in girls. Young women aged 15 to 24 are up to 5 times more likely to be HIV positive than young men. And given the demographics of Africa, with a pronounced youth bulge, leaving infection rates the same would mean the number of new HIV infections among women and girls would increase by 42% by 2030. That cannot be allowed to happen. It would be a disaster for the individuals, their families, and the communities in which they live. We must strengthen and scale up programs to meet the needs of adolescents across Africa, tackle the underlying structural inequalities, and empower women and girls to protect themselves. With a successful replenishment, we can step up the fight and significantly reduce new HIV infections by 2023. Turning to TB, the blunt truth is that we are not making nearly fast enough progress to reduce TB infections. On the current trajectory, we won't end the epidemic by the end of this century, let alone by 2030. This is the infectious disease which is killing more people than any other. We must step up the fight. The challenge of TB can be summarized in 2 charts. On the left is drug-sensitive TB, the type of TB that responds to conventional and cheap antibiotics. Roughly 10 million people a year fall ill with this kind of TB. The problem is that only about 6.4 million are identified and treated. So there are roughly 3.6 million missing cases. You don't have to be an expert epidemiologist to work out that if you're missing 3.6 million people a year with a highly infectious disease, you're not in control of the epidemic. The right-hand chart tells the story of multi-drug resistant TB, known as MDR-TB. This is an extremely nasty disease and a potent threat to global health security. 1/3 of all global deaths from antimicrobial resistance are due to MDR-TB. At the moment, we are failing to deal effectively with MDR-TB. Of the current total of nearly 600,000 cases, only about a quarter are diagnosed and treated, mainly with support from the Global Fund. That means more than 400,000 people with a disease that is roughly as fatal as Ebola, much more contagious, are left to suffer, to die, and to infect others. This is one issue on which we absolutely have to step up the fight. With a successful replenishment, we can change this picture, closing the gap on missing cases and sharply reducing infection rates. Finally, malaria. With malaria, we have come so far. Many countries are on track to eliminate the disease entirely. Paraguay and Uzbekistan, for example, were certified as malaria-free in 2018. But in the parts of the world with the highest disease burden, mainly in Africa, we are doing enough to save more lives every year, but not enough to break the transmission cycle between humans and mosquitoes. So in these countries, cases have actually been increasing. If we simply continue as now, malaria will be resurgent. To let this happen would be to throw away one of the great success stories of global health. By scaling up distribution and use of insecticide-treated nets in Africa from effectively 0 in 2000 to half the at-risk population using a net in 2017, alongside cheap and effective diagnostics and treatments and other tools, we have almost halved deaths from malaria. And remember, most of the deaths from malaria are children under the age of 5 and pregnant women. But population growth, mosquito resistance to existing insecticides, parasite resistance to the most commonly used drugs, plus natural disasters and security issues, mean that current funding levels simply aren't enough to get on top of the epidemic in the most affected places. Actually, malaria resurgence isn't a threat, it's a reality. So we must step up the fight. A successful replenishment would enable us to tackle these challenges, break the transmission cycle, and get many more places on track toward elimination. Beating the 3 big epidemics isn't just about disease-specific interventions. It requires building stronger and more resilient health systems. We need to do this to defeat AIDS, TB, and malaria. But we also need to do this to deliver on the overarching goal of SDG 3, to deliver health and well-being for all, and to accelerate progress towards the ultimate goal of universal health coverage. That's why the Global Fund invests over $1 billion a year in sustainable systems for health, making us the largest multilateral provider of grants for health system strengthening. We invest in health workers, data systems, supply chains, strong national health strategies, procurement and health financing. We're helping build the overall capacity of national health systems in ways that have benefits far beyond the 3 diseases, for maternal and child health, for health security, for the overall sustainability and efficiency of the health system. A successful 6th replenishment will enable us to step up this rate of investment in health systems from roughly $3 billion in this 3-year cycle to around $4 billion in the next. I know I've talked a lot about numbers, and they're important, but ultimately this is about people, about their lives, their families, their communities. This is Yalfal and her son, Yim. Yalfal was living on the streets of Addis when a community health worker found her and brought her to a health center. She was pregnant, and she also tested positive for HIV. She was put on treatment to prevent transmission of HIV to her baby, but the community health worker knew she needed more than just diagnosis and treatment, so she helped her find housing and also mother mentors, experienced mothers who could help her stay healthy and ensure she prevented transmission of HIV to her baby. Yim, the name means "this time will pass," was 8 months old when I met him and his mother, and was still HIV negative. For Yalfal, his mother, life has been transformed. As she said to me, "Yim gives me hope, he gives me purpose, and now I have a home, a community, a family." So the numbers are important, but even more, it's people like Yalfal and Yim. It's for them that we must step up the fight. Together, we can end AIDS, TB, and malaria. Together, we can accelerate progress towards the SDG 3 goal of health and well-being for all. To make it happen, we need more innovation, more collaboration, and more data-driven, rigorous execution. But we also need more money. To step up the fight and get back on track toward ending the epidemics of AIDS, TB, and malaria, we need at least $14 billion for the Global Fund's 6th replenishment. This is the moment. Ending AIDS, TB and malaria is within our reach, but not yet in our grasp. We can step up or we can slip back. We must step up the fight.